Thanks for coming in and talking to us today, Jay.
My pleasure, Corey. It's always nice to be on your show.
Yeah. And what I kind of said in the email, like what I want to get to is we've had all of this federal talk. We've had all of these political games going on for months. We have a federal government that's in a minority position, but they still, it appears, to be able to skate on a public inquiry. Like, I'm just wondering, are there parliamentary things that can be done to address this by the opposition parties, or are their hands tied?
Well, first of all, absolutely, there are things that can be done. I think you're well aware that I hold the dubious distinction of having been the only member of Parliament in the history of our Canadian Parliament to hold the position of caucus or party whip 4 times. My staff did some research and couldn't find any other time that anybody had been in that position twice, let alone 4 times. And I've also been the House leader, both in opposition for the chief opposition, but also for the government, which is a cabinet position, as you know. So I'm very well versed in, certainly in what can happen and how a government can be held accountable. Certainly, part of the reason why I decided to try something else other than public life in 2010 was at the time I had reached basically the apex of my political career. I was in cabinet. I was sort of sitting on the right hand of the prime minister at the time as the government house leader, or the leader of the government in the House of Commons. And as such, in a minority parliament, it's a very, very difficult position normally. Certainly for a conservative it is, because you have to negotiate with the other parties, Corey, bill by bill, motion by motion, daily, sometimes hourly, to try and get anything done for the government's agenda to get it through Parliament. And of course, with Conservatives, we don't have any natural allies. All the other parties are, shall we say, left of center. And so it was immensely stressful for the 2 minority parliaments that we had from 2006 to 2011, until Prime Minister Harper won his one and only majority. So I fully recognize what can be done and what can't be done when it comes to negotiating with the other parties. Sadly, for Canadians, we have an opposition party, the NDP, under the leadership of Jagmeet Singh, that has given our Prime Minister free rein to do whatever the hell he wants. And that's totally unlike the way we were held accountable, Harper Conservatives, in those 2 minorities that I was a part of.
Yeah, well, and just the talking out of both sides of his mouth, though, whereas Jagmeet Singh's been very critical, rightly so, of this whole scandal. I mean, see, we might as well call it that by now. You know, the scandal of the Chinese Communist Party interference, and the Trudeau government working so hard to block an inquiry by all means. But, you know, he's tabling motions, a non-binding motion, a non-binding motion. Well, big deal. It's virtue signaling. But are there things that can be... Are there things that can be done that could force this then without bringing down the government? Like, he's saying, okay, we'd have to, it's not worth bringing the government down over right now. I mean, not all of us might agree, but fine. But, you know, is opposition day, is there something they could put in as a bill or something that can force this without turning it to a confidence matter?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Prime Minister under our system always holds the trump card, Corey. I think you're aware of this, insofar as that he can declare any motion or any act, any piece of legislation, a confidence motion, which means that if that motion is defeated, if it falls, then we're into an election. That's what that means. But what we did, what Stephen Harper did when Prime Minister, and I as both his House leader and earlier as his government whip, we negotiated on a continual basis with the other parties to say, okay, well, how can we work with you to amend this so that it doesn't become a confidence measure? In fact, we never played that so-called trump card of declaring something a confidence unless we felt very clearly that it was so integral to our government agenda to what we were trying to accomplish for Canadians that we had no other choice. So that happened very rarely, that we would sort of have a showdown. And usually it was behind closed doors where you say, you know, face to face, well, this is so much part of our electoral promises or whatever, that if you're insistent, other House leaders, other whips, about getting your caucus to vote against it, and we lose this, then we're going to go into an election. That's very rare under most circumstances. The problem is that Jagmeet Singh never plays that card. He never, I'm sure he never says to the Prime Minister, or maybe behind closed doors, the Prime Minister indicates all the time to him, well, you know, if you go against this, Jagmeet, we're going to be into an election. In other words, he's playing that fear of a confidence motion constantly. Because stopping short of that, there's lots that can be done. At committees, opposition days, as you say, in the House of Commons, there's a few that are votable, that are actually driven to a vote. You could do a lot of things. This is not the first scandal. Mm-hmm. There have been many. And the Prime Minister has done this, Prime Minister Trudeau has done this repeatedly throughout the last number of years, where every time a scandal comes up, he'll do everything possible to hide it from Canadians, even up to and including calling an election, which he did in 2021. So it's just really, it comes down to having an extremely weak opposition party led by someone that doesn't want to see an election because he fears for himself in his leadership position, and he fears for his party's fortunes.
Oh, yeah, and I understand that. I mean, Jagmeet Singh is as close to power as he will ever get. He knows that, come the next election, he might not be in such a position again. But, I mean, it just feels to me that it's a bluff that it can be called. I mean, when you declare something a confidence matter, that means that you're building a hill for yourself to die on. You're saying, we're going to stand on this. And really, even Trudeau is as tone deaf as he can seem to be, to go to Canadians and say, we're going to call an early election because I don't want to go to an inquiry. I can't think of a more politically suicidal platform to go to the voters with. I just don't think he would
do that. So to answer your question, yes, an opposition day, certainly we had tremendous challenges at each and every committee. As you know, the Procedure and House Affairs Committee has been studying this issue, if you will. They called the, I forget what he's called now, rapporteur,
Mr. Rapporteur, yes.
Yeah, Mr. Johnston. Before them for a 3-hour testimony about a week ago, I think a week ago yesterday. And, put him on the hot seat asking questions about why his report basically said, well, no, he didn't think a public inquiry was necessary. Starting next month, had he stayed in his job before he resigned, he was going to start public hearings. Well, public hearings do not have the strength and do not have all the tools that a public inquiry have, as I'm sure you're aware. Mm-hmm. For example, a public inquiry is very much like the powers of a standing committee or even a special committee of the House of Commons. They have rights very similar to courts, where they can subpoena you and say, you will show up on this day to give evidence and answer questions. Public hearings, which Mr. Johnston allegedly was going to do, you cannot. They can request, they can ask you to come, but if you basically say go pound sand, nothing happens. So committees have that power. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have that power. They could easily, by dint of working with the other opposition parties, they could easily force those issues at a committee and hold basically a full public inquiry or something very similar to that at one of those committees. And you'll recall other instances over the last number of years since Trudeau came to power in 2015, where committees started to do that, and then eventually the NDP folded and didn't force it to go to its logical conclusion.
Okay, so they could start, because people want answers. We're seeing it's rare when we see such a dominant thing with polling in Canadians, the lack of faith in everything we've been hearing out of this. You're looking at 20-some% of the people believing anything more out of the Trudeau government when it comes to this issue. The numbers supporting the government are higher than that. Okay, they don't want to go in election, but they want to get to the bottom of this. They want to find out just what the heck is going on. We've had some very direct meddling, and it just flabbergasts me. Our system isn't working like it should. If we can't, in a minority situation, get a real deep dig into something this important, it doesn't bode well for us.
Well, and I think it really hinges to a large extent, and this is, I say this very sort of sadly, that it hinges on the topic you were discussing just as I came into the studio, which is the basic neutering of our national media. You know, why aren't they on to Jagmeet? Why aren't they calling bullshit with on Jagmeet Singh when he stands up and rants and raves about scandal after scandal and does nothing when he has the power to do that? All he has to do is sit down with the Conservatives and Bloc and say, okay, let's devise a common strategy of how to get to the bottom of this at whichever committee, Ethics Committee, Procedure and House Affairs, pick a committee, doesn't matter. They all have the same powers. And say, we're going to work together. We have the majority of votes on that committee because it's a minority government. And we're going to force this starting tomorrow, next time that committee meets. And we have the power to have that committee meet all summer, right through the heat of summer. You know, it doesn't have to rise when the House rises, you know, next week or whenever it is. They have that power. But the media and the public, you know, it's fine for, you know, the latest poll to say that 80% of Canadians, you know, are opposed to this, the way the government is going on this issue, right?
Yeah.
That's great. But is it going to accomplish anything?
Well, that's it. I mean, if their elected members can't bring about any, you know, change or getting into this, ask you to get, you know, a little speculative. The time goes fast. We still got a few minutes yet, but do you think we're going to get a public inquiry eventually?
I don't know. I mean, judging by the way that this prime minister is skated around other issues, whether it's the SNC Lavalin thing, that should have brought him down. I mean, my goodness, the Attorney General and Justice Minister of the country, Jody Wilson-Raybould, resigned over it, wrote a book over it, and still Canadians put up with this. I mean, so when we didn't over that, when we didn't over the we, he skated around that issue of trying to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars to the we, a company that he was clearly in a conflict with his members of his family receiving money for speaking engagements from that company, the We Foundation. You know, so it's been one, and that's just two that come to mind. Yeah. I was looking online a few days ago out of curiosity, and I challenge your viewers to do this. Go online and just Google Justin Trudeau scandals. It's page after page after page. It's almost impossible for journalists to keep up with. And the few journalists like yourselves that actually want to dig into it. So are we going to get one? You would think that logically he's going to be forced. But it's only the media that can force him to do that. I don't understand why his own party is letting this go on, because eventually, and I think we're reaching that point, that tipping point, if you will, where his star is going to be so much in decline that it's going to be very difficult for the Liberal Party to recover from it.
That's where I wanted to go next, actually. Was just wondering if that's one other area. I mean, we know there's principled Liberal members
Absolutely.
of Parliament, and they've got to be, you know, taking the flack from this stuff they had nothing to do with. They're embarrassed. Their constituents are on their case, and they're looking to their own political futures.
Yeah.
Liberals, I mean, that's just a fact. They tend to be better at keeping them all together than Conservatives. We love speaking out and ripping our own. I mean, that's our nature. But at some point, as you said, that tipping point might be hit where enough in caucus, he might finally get a caucus revolt, even if behind closed doors, but to say, look, that's enough. We're not going to go down with this shit.
Yeah, yeah. And it has happened in the past, I think, with both governing parties, whether it's ours, the Conservative Party. Like you say, I think that the record would show that within the Conservative Party, and it's both good and bad, that the leadership is held more accountable than what we see in the Liberal Party. I mean, most recently, Mr. O'Toole, right? It wasn't the general public or the media that eventually held him accountable. It was his own caucus. And we don't see that from the Liberals. And as you say, I worked with, well, partly because of the positions I held, I had to work daily, sometimes hourly, as I said, with my counterparts, with the House leaders and the whips of all the other parties. And I found most of them were very respectful and, putting forward an alternate point of view, but you could work with them. And so there are people in those ranks within the Liberal Party, the Liberal caucus, that should be holding him accountable because they're not profiting. In fact, arguably, as you say, it's their very futures that are in jeopardy because of the way that he acts every time one of these scandals comes along where he does everything. Well, and including, I think on the one, I don't remember which it was, where he actually launched a lawsuit against the Parliament of Canada to prevent them digging into something. So,
yeah, it's bizarre times. I mean, you know, another long shot, I'll throw out my speculation, but it's not impossible to think that maybe at a point Justin's going to take his walk in the snow like his father did.
Yeah.
And come back. I mean, that would be because he was getting the pressure inside to think, you know what, maybe I'll just bail out now, move on, put it to a leadership race. We can still kick the inquiry down the road, and maybe people will have forgotten about it and I can retire.
Yeah. No, I think that everybody runs their term of office and has to come to that decision, and some people are forced out. I've often remarked, I guess, that all too many politicians, you know, are like bad milk in the fridge. I mean, they stay around until they start to stink up the place.
Well, yeah, and I mean, even with great ones, it's been unfortunate. You know, with Premier Klein's a good example of it. I mean, he's a legend in Alberta. He did a lot of great things, but that last couple of years, it was kind of the hook was starting to come out. Okay, Ralph, maybe it's time to step aside. And he kind of left, you know, with his own parties turning on him a little, which is same with Chrétien. He was just in for too long.
Yeah,
but just not seeing it with Trudeau yet.
No, we're not. And I think that partly because of a lot of things. We've never been in a situation in our country where the major media has become the propaganda arm of the government through subsidization. That's never happened before until Justin Trudeau. And so that puts a very unique perspective on everything that's happening in and out of Ottawa. And had it not been for that, there may have been enough pressure from multiple sources, not just the sort of one of the lone voices in the wilderness, the Western Standard out here in Calgary saying these things, digging into these things, or Rebel News. You know, they're very few and far between. If you had some of the major networks doing the job they're supposed to do for Canadians, I think you know, maybe he would have already taken that walk.
Well, perhaps. Well, we'll see what happens. I said, you know, they're going to recess in a week or so. I suspect they're going to kick this can down the road until fall, and we'll see if public interest is still there when the time comes. I think so. It seems to me the leaks are going to keep coming. Whoever that is, they've got more. They're not going to let this go. Well,
sadly, the message I want to leave your viewers with is that don't make any mistake on this. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, every time you hear him say something critical of the government, call him out for what it is. He's being a hypocrite. It's complete hypocrisy. He has the power to work with the other opposition parties and drive these types of scandals to some form of public disclosure at minimum. And he and his caucus choose not to do that, and instead to prop up this scandal-ridden government.
Well, time will tell. All right. Well, thanks again for coming in, Jay. I just appreciate some explanation. You know, not everybody are political weenies like us that watch the procedure and what's going to be done and what can't be done, committees, things like that. And just, you know, the general audience, like they're frustrated readers and you know, what can be done. Just the confirmation that something can be done. They're just choosing not to. And well, we'll see what happens. So,
well, Canadian democracy, and especially in this case, Canadian democracy is the poorer for it. Yeah. I mean, I think that's why it's 80% of Canadians, is because there is an awakening to the fact that foreign interference in our election strikes at the very heart of everything that we stand for. I mean, a democracy has to stand on the legitimacy of its elections.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, Jay. It was great seeing you in here again. And
thanks for asking me.
Hope we can have you back again sometime soon. Maybe to start talking about the next election.
Well, hopefully we'll be into it sooner rather than later, because the country's going to be destroyed if it keeps going the way it is.
It does seem to be. All right. Well, thank you. So that was Jay Hill, as you heard. And yes, a regular guest here, a person who's certainly put in a long time of service on Parliament Hill and still managed to maintain his marbles out of all that time in there. It's quite surprising.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny.